She says I can start. I'm very sure that you are bored seeing me here again for the so manyth time, but it's for good reasons. And it's an honor because I get to announce these intriguing high-level panels. And this one is no exception, and possibly one of the coolest out there. Apologies for the bias here, but we get to hear from a very diverse, less traditional group of speakers on the need and way to put inclusivity at the center of the climate debate. And by way of pitch, inclusive trade will be the focus of the 2024 Public Forum. Kicking off the discussion is Hindu Omara Ibrahim of Chad as a leading activist for inclusion of the voices of the vulnerable in climate debates and policies. She has a message for us. Dana will then take over and lead this no doubt fascinating panel. Videos, please.
Dear all, I am happy to be with you even virtually for this important World Trade Organization Public Forum. Our roundtables today is on inclusive strategy for sustainable trade. It is a very important issue in a very important time. Important time because we are 8 years after the Paris Agreement and there is no progress on climate and SDGs. As an Indigenous woman, I can say that during the last year, I have been seeing CEO and many head of state recognizing the importance of Indigenous peoples and the role of our traditional knowledge and lifestyle for climate solutions. People understand that we need a shift in our economy, in our policies, to reconnect with nature and to let Indigenous peoples, citizens, civil society in a driving seat of implementation. But this shift is not occurrence because for the leaders, they speak well, but nothing happened. Nothing happened when you see, for instance, only 2% of the renewable energy investment go to Africa. Nothing happened when you still see the pressure on Indigenous land in order to transform the industrialized food, when we all know that Indigenous peoples manage better the ecosystem and it is the best option for the food security and protection of environment. This demonstrates that we cannot continuously using this model. It is not working. It is not delivering for climate, biodiversity, or peoples. But today, I am not angry. I should be, as many human beings on this planet, because as the UN General Secretary said recently, we are starting to collapse from climate change, and it is harmful to my people. It is damaging to all Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world. It is a threat for our survival. But I choose not to be afraid, but to fight back. That is why I am not angry. I am impatient for all the partners here in this forum, for all the participants for the next COP28 to make a real move. And this move is simple. Get away from fossil fuel. It's not hard, not for company, not for government, because we have the solution. And from my perspective, the international institutions such as WTO must lead by examples, by giving a positive signals. Trade for renewable energy, not for fossil fuel. Trade for the agriculture product that can fit all peoples. Trade for the independence, not for dependence. So let us get started now, here. I thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what promises to be a very interesting discussion this morning on inclusive strategies for sustainable trade. It's an honor to be here with you all. I want to just start, first of all, by introducing our panelists here today before we jump into the discussion. So I'll start with Dr. Margot Brown. She's the Senior Vice President for Justice and Equity at the Environmental Defense Fund. She has more than 20 years of experience working with communities of color, low-income, Indigenous and marginalized communities. She's developing a strategy to integrate environmental justice into organizational processes and also works with the Frontline Resource Institute for health and well-being for those most impacted by environmental injustice. Welcome to you, Dr. Brown. And then we have Karen Svensson, who is Chief Sustainability Officer for the Volvo Group, the leading manufacturer of commercial vehicles, trucks and buses. And she has been an active member in a number of transport-related external groups and organizations in Sweden, Belgium, and the US. She was also chairman of the board SAFER, the Vehicle and Traffic Safety Center, and is also on the board for the International Women Forum in Sweden. Welcome to you, Karin. Rangamarie Hunia is the director of Te Ukemona, the Maori Fisheries Commission, which is an indigenous organization of 58 tribes across Aotearoa, New Zealand, and she works to protect and advance Maori fishing interests and rights, the health and well-being of the oceans, and raising the capability of tribal communities to craft change through the legislation and policy on fishing and oceans. Welcome to you, Rangamarie. And finally, last but not least, Vladislav Kame is an economist, analyst, and climate action and sustainability advocate, an expert consultant on youth engagement for the NDC's process of the Paris Agreement. He helped lead the effort on youth-friendly implementation for the UN Secretary General's climate strategy, and was the first lead on green jobs for the youth constituency of the UNFCCC. He's also a former IMF Youth Fellow, Young European Ambassador. Welcome to you, Vladislav. It's so great to have you all with us. I want to just start by jumping into the conversation then, and let's start with you, Margot, if you can. Just give us a sense of how you look at the climate crisis being here for most of the world, imminent for the rest of them. How do you look at that in your day-to-day life and see opportunities for justice, opportunities for environmental change in a positive way?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. I think that the climate crisis it's present. It's present in every day and every way in our lives. But the one thing that I think about when I think about the climate crisis is how we approach it through justice and equity. So what does that mean? It means that we have to rethink how we engage with everyone. Right now, there are a very small group of people who are driving the decision-making process around climate. And we have to broaden our net. We have to bring in as many people as possible. We've been sort of talking to ourselves in the same circles with the same people for the last 30 years. And it's time to broaden that net and to bring in more people. And as we bring in those people, we need to bring them in a just and equitable way. And so what does a just and equitable way mean? You'll hear a lot of people say, well, we need to have people who haven't been represented get a seat at the table. And in my mind, a seat at the table is the floor. Every human being should have a seat at the table. When you get to the part of policy advocacy, it's imperative that those individuals that have been shut out from the process have the tools and resources that they need to be able to engage. So that's what I do in my work at the Environmental Defense Fund, is really help develop tools and resources for historically marginalized groups across the globe so that they are able to engage in the policy debate and advocate for themselves around the climate crisis and not have someone speak on their behalf.
And Karin, if I can bring you in here, how do you see climate change impacting, picking up on what Margot said there, how do you see climate change impacting the work you do and how you can bring other people into the conversation and give them the floor, as she said?
I think coming from the Volvo Group, logistics and transportations, that's our core business, and that's something that plays a critical role in everyone's life if we want to get food on the table, if we want to go to work, go to school, etc. And the need for transportation is actually increasing quite a lot. But that need, as transportation is one of the major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, that need has to be met with substantially more sustainable solutions. Therefore, the transport industry is in the middle of a huge transformation. For example, the Volvo Group has as an ambition to become net zero by 2040. And we are working on several measures to make that happen. We are, for example, electrifying vehicles, trucks, buses, and different types of machines, but we are also replacing materials and components in our vehicles with fossil-free alternatives or recyclable alternatives. But there is also a need of political framework conditions. There's a need for a positive investment in environment and financial support tools for new and innovative technologies. We are therefore actively trying to improve policies and measures related to trade in order for us to be able to sell, to produce, and to develop our sustainable products globally. 4 things I wanted to bring to your attention. First of all, we believe in a price on carbon, putting a price on carbon, and we encourage effective carbon pricing instruments. Secondly, financial incentives need to be harmonized. For example, we need to have simple and predictable state aid rules. We also need to review competition policies and rules. Today, competition law and sustainability is often in conflict. In Europe, we see today more opportunities for companies actually to cooperate if it benefits the climate, and I think that's really crucial because climate change is such a huge challenge. It's very complex, it's very expensive, and not the least, it's too urgent not for us to cooperate around. Also, we see policy competition in the field of the green transition between countries, between regions. We are, for example, seeing carbon border adjustment mechanism. We are seeing the Inflation Reduction Act. For us as a company, that will have an impact on us with regards to risks and opportunities, but not the least, it will also impact the way we take decisions around trade. Last point I want to make is that transportation is not the only thing impacting climate change, but climate change is of course also impacting us, and especially then trade patterns. Climate change makes it even more important for us to secure logistics and supply chain, and from a policy perspective, it's important that initiatives within, for example, WTO are of global character.
Thanks, Karen. And if I can just ask you, Rangamaria, here to jump in. You know, Karen talked about this kind of need for cooperation. Obviously, that's something that you work with as well, trying to, represent different communities. How, a kind of similar question for you. How do you see the climate crisis? Is there room for opportunity there to be more cooperative, to be able to bring different perspectives to solve this crisis, and how does that look like for you?
Firstly, kia ora koutou katoa e whakawhaiti I roto I tēnei kaupapa I tēnei pō, a tēnei rā, tēnei ka mihi kia koutou katoa. It's a privilege and honour to be here, and I just want to take the time firstly to acknowledge all of the Indigenous peoples that have made their time and they've made their way to be here in this conversation over the last couple of days. History is being made for Indigenous people, so I want to labour that point. I also want to thank the members of the panel. Today we've been called cool. I haven't been called cool in a long time, so thank you. We also want to thank Dr. Ngozi and the WTO team. I understand that today is the first time that we've had Indigenous peoples represented in a high-level panel like this at the WTO Public Forum. And so, Dana, I do think it's really important to state the real obvious. Having Indigenous peoples and their voices are critical to the future conversation around inclusive strategies and trade. We also hope that from today the milestone translates into enduring action where Indigenous peoples and Indigenous solutions are woven with WTO and trade policies that are so desperately needed for the future. So the question around how do we represent communities through the climate crises now and in the future, importantly, and I think it's a message that has been shared across the last couple of days, we must keep it simple. And in our world, having clear shared purpose, having respect, having action, and having hope are critical there. Māori are the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. We are miles away, we are far away from home. And we are in this foreign space trying to share and offer a different way of seeing the world and seeing potential solutions for tomorrow. We have a holistic relationship with the natural world. Our purpose is simple: look after the environment, and the environment will look after you. That is a mindset that has been handed down for generations. It is a mindset that has been activated for centuries. And many of the Indigenous peoples that we've heard over the last couple of days have talked in that vein. It is important that we all have a clear shared purpose. The other piece about this is that the health of our people relies on the well-being of the environment, and we acknowledge that oceans and land are interconnected. We don't think about the ocean, the health and well-being of the ocean, without also respecting and acknowledging the health and well-being of the land. It is a mindset, it is a way of viewing the world. Secondly, for a sustainable future, a multi-generational approach is critical. We will be good ancestors. That is what we are raised to believe. And to be good ancestors, we must make great decisions today. And that means we must think about the generation that we will never know and ensure that they have something there for their tomorrow, for their prosperous tomorrow. The third point in our world is theory is good, but theory or policy without practice is hopeless. That is what our aunties, that is what our uncles, that is what our children remind us about all the time, that we must act. And to do that, every tribe, every community, every household, every person has a role. Māori and tribes have unique concerns, we have expectations, and we know the appropriate actions that need to be taken to be resilient and to be able to face the challenges of climate. This is important that we are able to see, and I think Dr. Ngozi, you talked about this for the last couple of days. WTO is about people, and WTO is looking for action, and action belongs in and amongst the community, which I think aligns beautifully with our Indigenous perspective. The last point I'd like to make is that we are hopeful about the future. Before coming here, I've never been so scared about tomorrow. We must be hopeful. And to be hopeful, we have to care for one another, we have to look after one another, we have to respect one another, and we have to be able to share. We have to share together in this time of devastation. That is key. And in terms of the way that our Indigenous thinking is applied, that is critical. Not only as Indigenous people must we share, but as a global community. And so being here today, our role really is to share this perspective and offer this as a solution for WTO in the world.
Thank you, Rangamari. And finally, Vlad, if I can turn to you, just to pick up a little bit there on what all the panelists have been saying. They've been talking about cooperation, they've been talking about hope for the future. How does that resonate with the work you do in terms of centering climate in these discussions when it comes to youth-led organizations and the hope that you see there and the opportunities you see there?
First and foremost, I would like to thank the Director General and the WTO for the opportunity to be one of the young voices here at the forum and to prove by showing that youth expertise is more and more in demand in the international institutions, which is crucial not only from the intergenerational point of view, but in its own right. And to your question, Dana, hope is not something that is nice to have in the context of our work. It's something that is essential. The youth climate movement, in its latest iteration that emerged a couple of years ago, it is a movement that has to take a long-term perspective, not only by virtue of our age, but also by virtue of our awareness of the sheer scale of transformation we need to lead and the time it will take. And the only way you can go through it, because the way of this transformation will lie through and is lying through a lot of disappointments, hoops, temporary setbacks, and so on. And hope, especially if it's coupled with concrete objectives of your work, when you have this inner sense and understanding of what exactly and whom you are doing it for, is essential in order to continue to steer the course. For my work, for example, what was always key is to make sure that youth from the working class background in the regions which I hold most dear, which is Eastern Europe and the Swedish Arctic, are able to have access to the full potential that the rise in demand for green skills and green jobs bring with themselves. That is why, for example, in the UN, I dedicated myself to make sure that institutions within the UN system and private actors bring themselves to a concentrated effort to actually deliver something like this. And that is why at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we launched the Green Jobs for Youth Pact. And when it comes to the wider work, if we were to detach a little bit from my own perspective here, what we also need to understand is that the climate movement in its current state, it's putting this hope to practice. We passed the stage where it needed to be awareness to be raised. It is already undeniable for everyone. But now we are in the stage where each of us finding its own path to what for them climate justice means and how you bring this vision through. And then at the end of it, you do what Margot so eloquently put it out. You make sure that what you do is not hinging only on you, but with your own work, you also put the way for many others to join and pursue those objectives to make sure that there is indeed a wider consensus in society on the climate policy. And most importantly, there is a community that is wide, inclusive enough, but at the same time deep in its knowledge to keep pursuing the objectives once you move to something else, which is okay because young people have changing interests and careers, obviously.
Thanks. And I just wanted to kind of bring up something that you talked about, and Maria talked about as well. I think you all did, actually, in terms of, okay, people have to have the floor, right? I think that's what you said, Margot. How do you go about doing that? How do you create the space is the wrong phrase, but how, you know, how do we make sure that that space exists, basically, for that action to be taken?
I think the first thing that we have to do, and it's always incumbent upon us, is to listen. We're always very, ready to give our perspective. But one of the most important things that I do in my job is listen. And I listen radically. And with that radical listening, I'm able to learn a lot to begin to work towards solutions. So what does that look like exactly in my work? When I came to the Environmental Defense Fund, our organization had some distrust, to be completely honest, around environmental and climate justice and how we had operated as a body in that space. And I knew I had a lot of work to do. So I went out and started talking to anyone who would listen to me. And I talked to over 200 people. And in all of those conversations, there was one word that began to appear over and over and over again. And that word was capacity. And I was shocked because it didn't matter where people sat on this spectrum. Some people would say, EDF should not be doing justice and equity work, and other people would say, EDF should be paying reparations. And it was this, vast chasm of opinions. And they all agreed that there was a greater need for capacity. And I leaned in because of that deep listening, and EDF gave me the opportunity in the space with my colleagues to create the Frontline Resource Institute. And the Frontline Resource Institute has been built by and for frontline leaders who are able to help us determine what resources are needed in the space of environmental and climate justice. I am a firm believer that the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Let me say that again because that is the most critical thing. The people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And it is imperative that we radically listen to what they're saying and provide them with the resources that are required for them to engage in the policy debate. And when we do that, what's going to happen is we're going to have a richer and more informed debate. And we're going to have better and more holistic solutions. And so, that's really how I approach this work, is through radical listening and the deep understanding and belief that the people who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I think if we began to embrace that philosophy, we would move forward at a much greater speed and scale of addressing the climate crisis.
And Rangamaria, if I can bring you in here as well, because you know what, Dr. Brown is speaking about is something that you look into as well. How do you do what Margot was talking about without almost placing a burden on these communities? How do you include them in the conversation without saying, well, this is your job to work out?
Again, I think part of the answer here is that in terms of listening, this has to be fundamental. I agree with Margot. Part of this is also about making sure that we use the word being in service to the kaupapa and being in service to our people. And that idea of radical listening is also about servitude and humility. And when we think about servitude and humility, that also requires an action for a generation that you will never know. And again, I'm labouring the point here that we must have a mindset about doing this for generations. Equally, for Aotearoa and for Māori, and in terms of fisheries, we have 58 tribes. They will tell us what is important. And one of the things that they have said to us is that development is not just about profit and growth. Actually, development must be include profit, but with responsibility to care for the natural environment. Having that understanding is important. It would not be acceptable to Māori that we would be out there developing, trying to accumulate wealth and trying to grow for growth's sake without being able to look after the environment. So being clear about that. To do that also, what we have to do is look after the way that we are managing these resources, which means that the communities have to have their own ability to lead that. And we have that. Each of our tribes are self-determining. They lead, but with a common purpose. They share with a common purpose. We have tribes, we have sub-tribes, we have families, we have individuals, and all the time we are constantly moving to a common goal. And at the heart of that is our culture, at the heart of that is our people, at the heart of that is our economy, at the heart of that is our political ability to make decisions for ourselves. Now that has been stripped from Indigenous peoples, and I think we all understand the plight of Indigenous peoples, and we have had to reaffirm over generations the ability to make our own decisions. When we do that, success will follow, success has followed.
Thank you. And I want to just pick up on something that you said there, Karen. I want to go to you about this idea of, well, if you want to put environment first, if you want to put people first, do you think this conflicts at all with the more capitalist goal, shall we say, of profits? After all, you know, businesses want to make profits. How do you tackle that in your role?
Yeah, I think first of all, we don't see a contradiction between sustainability and profitability. Of course, we need to be profitable in order to drive the sustainability transformation that we need to do. But if we are not taking both the social developments and the protection of the environment into account, there will be much, much bigger costs in the future that we will have to handle. So for us, it has, we are, for example, we have committed to the science-based targets, and what we can see is that more and more companies are taking action against or towards the science-based targets every year. And if we look upon those companies, many of them, when they start making an inventory of their greenhouse gas emissions, they will see and they will find that transportation is one of their major emitters. So of course, having as a business to do transportation, if we can do sustainable transportation, we can help a lot of these companies that in some cases are our customers and in some cases not, to become more sustainable. So I think for us, our mission with creating sustainable transportation goes very well hand in hand, so I don't see a contradiction. I also wanted to pick up a little bit upon the points here, what we can do to include people, and I think something that has not been obvious for business before, but what I think at least is very obvious for us right now, is that this transformation will require a whole ecosystem. And if we are to succeed, we need to be much more transparent about our plans than we have been in the past. We also need to trust each other in a different way. we also need to be able to share risk in new ways. And I'll come back a little bit to this later on, but I wanted to point out that both internally among our own employees, but also externally, and then I'm talking about our customers, our suppliers, our investors, but also in our communities, we need to explain this transformation that we're on. And we need to be transparent on what our plans are so that other people can connect to that, so that we can jointly work on this transformation. I think a lot of people want the same thing, but unless you share how you see that journey, it's going to be very difficult for people to connect. And there are going to be conflicting objectives, but then you need to talk about them.
Ladslav, I think you agree with that growth and sustainability aren't necessarily at odds with each other, is that right?
I think so, but it's not without its caveats. So first and foremost, from the splendor of Geneva Lakeside is perhaps important not to forget that the world as it is right now, it's still quite poor and unequal in order to afford itself to just switch off the development like this completely. One of the most prominent scholars of inequality, Branko Milanovic, made a calculation a few years ago on what would exactly happen if we did just that, and then redistributed extremely equally all the wealth that has been existing in the world. And he landed at a median figure of income annually per person, somewhere around $5,500. This is clearly not a level of development that, if it came into existence, would allow us to make a significant leap forward in terms of green transformation. And development is a very investment-dependent process. And when we hear people, not only at the WTO Public Forum, but at many other fora, we're talking about, like, what does green transition need? Like, what is this jolt that it's needed? Everybody says investment. So development will have to be with us because we need investment to spur it. However, critical voices of the development as it was practiced in the last half of century, they also have a point, because, for example, there have always been the groups like Indigenous people who, without much consultation, were always asked to take one for the team, so to speak, to take their interest on the chin for the development that they saw no stake in having and saw no benefits in. But it is important not to lose sight of the fact that the model of development that we had and that we experienced in the last half century, it's not the development, and it's only this or nothing. It is a policy choice to reinvent development, and it is within our forces, within our imaginations, within our minds to do just that. And we have a decent shot still, and I'm convinced of that, that bringing together these perspectives, including through the process that Margot labeled as radical listening, we can come to a model of development that allows us to grow together in a way that is less extractivist, in a way that is less classist, and in a way that is ultimately way more legitimate than the model we had in the last couple of decades.
Margot, I saw you nodding there when Vlad was talking about Indigenous people, and Indigenous communities having to take it on the chin or just, accept things or does that resonate with you in terms of the work you look into?
It resonates really deeply with me, and I'm from the United States, so I bring to this stage a U.S. perspective. And I want to share a story with everyone about a group that I've been working with in the Gulf of Mexico. This group is the Ildejan Charles Biloxi Chimamata Choctaw tribe. And this tribe has experienced 98% land loss because of climate change. And what's so devastating about this tribe is they started in northern Louisiana and Arkansas. And in the United States, about 100 years ago, we pushed Indigenous people off of their land, and it was called the Trail of Tears. And so they were pushed from their original land down into the Gulf of Mexico. And they lived there for generations and thrived. And because of climate change and because of solutions to sort of divert, or what we thought at the time were solutions to divert the Mississippi River, This community has experienced 98% land loss, and they are no longer able to inhabit their land. And because they cannot inhabit their land, they had to be relocated 40 miles inland. And with that relocation now, their entire world has changed. Their culture is going to be forever changed. And so one of the things that this group is really determined to do is to preserve their culture. How do you preserve your place in the world when it no longer exists? And I've been working with them for the better part of 5 years on a construct called the preservation of place. And it's preserving your place when it no longer exists in the world. And the saddest part about it is it's all of that traditional ecological knowledge that came along with that place that we will lose. And a lot of that knowledge, within that knowledge, there might be solutions to some of the challenges that we're facing. And so how do you preserve that knowledge today to help us meet the challenges of tomorrow?
Maria, can I ask you about that as well, in terms of how Indigenous communities facing kind of land loss in that example, but a multitude of other things, kind of how we then, is it a matter of reversing, or is it a matter of preserving in the new way, or what is it?
Where it comes to Indigenous rights and Indigenous voice, there are always pressures to achieve goals or act in a certain way. And most of the time, it's not our goals and it's not our way. And this is frustrating. It's frustrating and it's a constant battle. And Māori have experienced this for generations and for centuries. One of the common views, and I think Vlad talked about this, when it comes to the oceans and fishing, there is a common narrative that is constantly coming to Māori that we shouldn't be fishing because that's not a good environmental practice. That is the narrative. That is completely at pole opposites to what WTO has been advocating for over the last couple of days that I've been here. We cannot get to the 2050 goals without trade. We can't decarbonise without trade. We can look after the environment, do well economically, and care for our people. I want to go back to what Maui, one of our rangatira that is here today with us, he said the other day, 80% of the planet's remaining biodiversity is located in Indigenous people's land. Despite the fact that Indigenous people make up around 15% of the world's extreme poor and just 5% of the global population, we are protecting 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. That has been in a report that has been done by Australia, so I want to acknowledge Australia for the work that they've done in the state of the environment. So we are doing something right, and being at forums like this is critical to ensure that our voice, our perspectives, and the work that we are doing has a place and space in an international agenda. And I think particularly at the WTO, an earlier panel that I was in, they had said inclusive strategies are not straightforward. Gender and Indigenous peoples is not straightforward. Yet what we would say is that we have something to offer the world, and we just need a place and space where those decisions can be made wisely.
And Vlad, can I just ask you to pick up on some of the points made here? Just how do you see, in terms of youth organizations, in terms of youth, in terms of future generations, as Rangamaria had talked about, is there, how do we make the space for that? Or, how do we give them existing space?
Well, as Ragni Marie first and foremost put it out, it's not a straightforward process. We have to perform it across 193 countries with wildly different contexts. However, in the context of the wider youth climate movement, it's important to understand the ladder you need to climb in order to address those intergenerational disadvantages of power distribution that we have to surmount in order to put our agenda forward and actually convert it into something. To give you an example, the climate movement, especially before the pandemic, but also so as now, it is very prized for its visibility, for its public image. We are in the spotlight. We are at COPs. We are here. We are at the UN. We're everywhere. But there is also this sense that, especially sometimes in the media coverage, that that's about it. That's how it should be. Well, the unfortunate part is that whatever media acumen you have, it is not going to help you when you walk into a room where there are no cameras to actually put your points across with the people who actually have the decision-making power and who have multiple trade-offs to juggle. So the takeaway from here that I would like to put to the audience is that when you support the fight of the climate movement, for example, to redistribute political and economic power away from the extractivist elites and the extractivist consensus, supporting the efforts to give the movement visibility is only the first step to this success. But increase in the visibility itself, while beneficial for bringing a much wider range of perspectives in, does not in and of itself equal the start even of the effective redistribution of power and the outcomes that come with it. So it is important when you enter the movement, when you are in the movement, when you support it from the outside, to be there for the long haul, because what is seen in the public is the tip of the iceberg, proverbial iceberg at best.
I want to move this conversation very quickly onto technology. Sorry for the sharp segue there, but Karen, I want to just come to you because technology, green technologies in particular, this is something that you are very focused on at the moment. Can you just give us an example of how that opens up opportunities to have, firstly, more sustainable trade and more sustainable business model, and also in terms of inclusivity, how that comes into it?
Yes, absolutely. As I said before, this transformation into sustainable transportation is not something that we can do ourselves. It will require a full ecosystem that moves in pace. It will require a system perspective on the transformation and completely new ways of working. So we need to work not only with our own employees, our customers, investors, suppliers, NGOs and other groups, but we also need to work probably with our competitors on these challenges. Because today, roughly half of the emissions reductions needed in order for us to reach the climate goals in 2050, these rely on technologies that are still in development phase or in very early prototype phases. So we need to take these technologies and accelerate them so that they can become cost competitive and come to the market within 10 years from now. And how can that then be done? And I think the only way we can do that is through innovative ways of working and new types of partnerships. And I would therefore like to mention one very interesting initiative that we joined a couple of years ago called the First Movers Coalition. The First Movers Coalition was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. It was launched by the World Economic Forum and by John Kerry, the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. It's a coalition of companies and of governments that are using our purchasing power then to create early markets for green technologies in especially then hard to abate sectors like steel, trucking, aviation, aluminium, etc. And through the First Movers Coalition, companies like us, we commit to buy a certain level of, for example, zero emission trucking or zero emission steel, etc. We do that and we set a target for 2030, and we do that despite that there will be, of course, a premium cost for that. I think this is a good example how we can share risks between partners. It's a good example of how we together can advance different technologies and make them cost competitive and come to the market. But it's also a good example of how larger companies and governments can make sure that these technologies also reach markets, countries, and companies, and in the end, people then that might not be able to afford that development that needs to happen right now.
Marco, can I ask you to come in here? How do you sort of balance green technology, you know, the need for massive scales up to change how we consume energy, for example, without coming at the cost of people's health, the environment? How does that work?
I think we have to rethink, as multinational corporations, as we're developing technology, the how. The how is so critically important. If you look at the petrochemical industry, they, with industrialization being the driver there, they move forward. And the ramifications have been horrific for many people and places across the globe. And so when we're building technology, let's start in reverse. Let's create a new process for how we develop technology. Let's start with communities. Let's start with people. Let's start with the desired outcome of the technology, and then let's look 7 generations ahead, like many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters do. And let's sort of think through what are the possibilities of this technology, and what are the outcomes? Like, for example, with solar panels. What's the like right now, everybody's moving to solar, which is fantastic. We're getting away from petrochemicals. But as you're building that solar panel, what's the lifespan for that panel? Where does that panel go when the lifespan is over? The materials that are created to build that panel, where are those materials coming from? How are they impacting those communities, both now and in the future? And so we should be thinking about this as like an ecosystem. We tend to think about it as just a technology and just a solution. But if we thought about it as an ecosystem with a continuum of 7 generations, when we build a technology, it would be my hope that we wouldn't be in the place that we are right now with petrochemicals.
And Rangamaria, that kind of picks up on ideas that you mentioned in terms of thinking about the environment first, and then the people will take care of it, and then it will take care of people for you in a way. How do you see that kind of linking with technology?
Well, I got excited when I was listening to you, Karen, because part of this also is about connecting. The thing about Indigenous peoples, or thing about Māori, is we are a developing nation within a developed country. And we need access to those technologies to be able to advance our communities. We don't have it. We're too far away. It is a pipe dream in many instances. And so the beautiful thing about being here in these sorts of conversations is that you meet people who are actually changing the landscape of tomorrow. And the question for me is, how does that technology come to offshore so far away, and what can we learn from that? One of the things about our population, so this is a long way of an ask. Vlad is really good at it. Vlad, well done. You've inspired me to try and ask. I'm asking the question, 17% of our country is Indigenous. And I'm confident that if we had the ability to apply and to incorporate new technologies in partnership with the best minds in the planet, we would be able to illustrate and model how you can develop sustainable futures together. And I'm excited by that. And I think we take for granted that these great things are happening, but Indigenous peoples will always be the last receiver. And so how do we actually change that dynamic in partnership with the reciprocity that we will share the learnings and help to be able to transform that? When I think about the majority of the Māori asset base is in the primary sector: agriculture, horticulture, fishing, forestry, farming. That is where the majority of our asset lies. And to be able to get to the goals that have been ambitiously set, we can't do it alone. It's not possible. So the goal is how do we partner in a different way, and not just between governments and corporates, but also governments and communities, and then how do we transform that to be able to apply it. We would love to be able to turn all of our fleets into green fleets tomorrow. We don't have subsidies. We don't get subsidies from the government, and we're not saying that we should. But that means that our ability to access that is very different, and it'll take a longer time. Yet, the scale with which we can prove a concept, I think, is worthwhile having a go at.
So to turn your question back, how do we do that? To turn that question to the panel, how do we bring these technologies to everyone, essentially? Vlad, do you have any thoughts?
I think that international organizations have a duty as a convener in these matters that they unfortunately kind of shirked from. We, for example, do not see an awful lot of progress in this regard within the UNFCCC and within other UN institutions responsible for climate action. But the WTO also should get its fair share of homework in this regard. And to exemplify what I mean by this is that we know that one of the key goals that is going to be probably adopted at COP28 in Dubai is going to be tripling the renewable energy production by 2030. But it requires some very important steps to get there. And one of them, obviously, is to make sure that the goods that are required for us to build renewable energy industry can flow between the countries and jurisdictions with as few impediments as possible. And this is where WTO can really step up, because it has something called Environmental Goods Agreement that is signed by 48 blocs and countries. And it would be of great use if the WTO and key leaders within it would stand up and say, hey, we can be a significant part of the solution through this agreement. And in order to make sure that this solution is even better, we will work even harder and make sure that it's an agreement that is even deeper in scope and attracts even more countries into it. But, and here comes the greatest task of them all, is that it goes beyond countries and blocs signatories, but also brings communities, especially indigenous communities, in it, for a very simple reason. We are going to be, and we already are, dependent a lot on the environmental goods or materials for said environmental goods that are located on the lands inhabited and considered sacred by indigenous people. And this will be a key test for whether we can actually create and make work a model of development and a model of investment that learned from its bloody lessons of the past. And make sure that you bring on board, in a holistic sense, all those who have a stake in making sure that we have this trade in environmental goods that works for the goals that are set in a rather technocratic way, but also for very concrete people in the communities who are waiting to finally get the benefits that they were promised years, if not decades ago, all over the world.
Thanks. A few people in the audience agree with you there, Vlad. Margot, can I bring you, and I saw you nodding there. How you work in this, right? How do we kind of implement these things and bring voices in, and how do we do it? How do we respond to Rangamari's point there?
I think my fellow panelists have laid it out. I mean, I think Vlad has beautifully laid out what's needed. I think the hardest part is actually acting on what he just said. And so how do we truly commit to what he is saying? I mean, you know, my grandmother used to always say, I can't hear what you're saying because I'm too busy watching what you're doing. And so if we begin to act on what he said and follow through, there's tremendous opportunity here. And we have to act on that opportunity, because look at what's happening in the world right now. We don't have a choice. And so I think that if it's just, I don't remember which one of the panelists said it at the beginning, it's not that hard. This is really simple. And so let's get going.
I want to turn to the audience now. If you have any questions for the panel, if you would just like to raise your hand and introduce yourself. You, sir, in front of me, please.
Hi. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Victor Minotti from the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. And I recognize Vlado here from the UNFCCC Youngo constituency, where I'm the DCJ constituency. I didn't know you were so knowledgeable about WTO, but I was disappointed to hear you advocate for the ESG, or rather the EGS, Environmental Goods and Services Agreement, which governments can already reduce their trade barriers on these goods and services if they want to. They don't need an agreement that's enforced by the WTO to do this. I was hoping you would say that what the WTO could do would be to relax the rules on intellectual property rights, which is the main barrier that developing countries have been calling for to increase the sharing of technology that we need to deal with the climate emergency. I wonder if you or any of the panelists can also address that.
So for me, these objectives are not mutually exclusive. And I think that the more we start actually working on the environmental goods and services problem, the more the intellectual property problem will come up in and of itself. And it will eventually push itself even further into the spotlight. And it will reach a degree of public pressure and the pressure from the global south countries that the global north countries will not be able to deny. And we have seen it in the debate about the COVID vaccines and so on. So to me, those two are not mutually exclusive. And for the second part is that, yes, governments can do their work on liberalizing trade, environmental goods and services on their own. But also, let's not fool ourselves. They are doing it for their own benefit, mostly, because they are accountable to their own citizens, rather than for a bigger collective good. And this is where organizations like WTO have duty to step up and make sure that it's also like that environmental goods become public goods, as I call. And when you transform something into public good, this is where the intellectual property question is key. Because if we are to transform the trade in this sector into something that will be in demand and is in demand all over the world, including in the communities who previously the most affected by climate injustice, make sure that the protections that are too much in its scope and clearly are defined to favor certain interests, like intellectual property protections, are torn down is key.
Would anyone else like to come in? Other questions? You, sir?
Thank you very much. Fernando Hernandez from both ends. On the price of carbon, I had a heated debate yesterday on that. 40% of the global emissions since 1850 have been generated since the WTO's founding in the mid-90s, according to the UNFCCC's recent report prepared by the COP, for the COP28. So I agree that the price must be paid on carbon emission, but not only now, but also for all of the carbon that has been emitted in the process of industrialization of the rich countries. This would send a signal of solidarity, obviously, on this global inequality and in this climate injustice to the world, and provide the finance needed for the net zero emissions as stated in Paris Agreement. I think this is something that we need to recognize. I also believe that fundamental changes need to happen at the WTO. I would like to bring this conversation not only in a high-level panel, but also to the center, as Margot was saying it. Those closer to the problem are actually the ones closer to the solutions. So let's go to that. I think the WTO export-led growth model encourages countries and companies to reorient economies to be more fossil fuel-driven. External costs, those more emissions that cause climate change. Wouldn't you agree with this statement? WTO can also play a positive role in climate policy by removing barriers to technology transfers upheld by the TRIPS. I think that's what the sir before me said. And these are really problematic. You mentioned the COVID vaccine, but I think that was actually not the full deal that the people of the world was expecting. And finally, we must plan for a world with much less or even no trade, given that in 2023, for the first time, we saw that Category 5 hurricanes in all the 5 oceans happened, where extreme weather is increasingly destroying trade infrastructure and derailing ocean transportation. Wouldn't you agree with this? Thank you very much.
So just to pick up on a couple of your points there and put them to the panel. Your first one, I think, being on the price of carbon and kind of sort of generational, is that right? Just going back almost to the start, to industrial, the start of the industrial era, in terms of carbon. Would that work? Would we like to see that work? Margot, can I come to you?
Can I pass for just a moment? I'm like deeply thinking, he put out a lot there, and so I'm like really resonating with the question.
Sure. Karen?
For us, of course, the main issue has rather been on how we can put a price on carbon right now. We think that that's really one of the things that needs to happen in order for the transition to happen. If we look today, for example, if we have one of our customers that is driving a diesel truck compared to an electric truck, it has to be substantially more cheaper, to use that word, to drive 1 kilometer on one electric rather than one on diesel. So I think for us, the main issue is really moving forward. Then I can see your point, but for us, that has mainly been the focus.
Margot, would you like me to come back to you?
Yes, yes, please.
Oh, your microphone?
Yes, please.
Yes. So, sorry, your thoughts on the price of carbon, or indeed any of the points that the gentleman raised.
I think that I want to take his whole answer. I don't want to just separate it into one piece. Oh, can you? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I want to take his answer as a whole and to really begin to think about how we do this with a systems approach. I think a lot of times we take like the price of carbon and we take another issue and we take another issue, and it's important to focus on each issue. It really is. But it's equally important, I mentioned this in one of my earlier comments, around thinking about all of this as an ecosystem. And you can't just focus on one without looking at the other. And so I would challenge everybody here today, how do we begin to think about the ecosystem of all of the different parts and how they come together, and how some of these parts are at odds with others, and especially how they're at odds with the environmental and climate justice perspectives. Because I think until we do that, it's going to be really tough to get to where we need to go. And so instead of answering the question, I would throw the question back out to the audience and to everyone and to ask you, how do you begin to think about this sort of with an ecosystems approach? I don't have the answer. I don't know, but I'm saying this is the approach that I think we should be using.
And I think we have time for one more quick question. You, sir, at the back there.
Thank you. My name is Emmanuel Wachendo. I'm from the Institute of Economic Affairs, a think tank in Nairobi, Kenya. And my question to the whole panel is about what you think the role of domestic accountability is in these very grand and very important objectives we're pursuing. So if I give a specific example, our colleague on the panel just talked about looking, having a whole of systems approach, I think is what she called it. And so then if for example, you have, there is no domestic accountability. So I'll give the example of public debt, right? And if the system has no incentives for leaders at the domestic level to be held accountable, whether they're dealing with their own citizens or they're dealing at the global level, then one scenario that is actually, it is actually happening is you have a leader or a political class or, those in leadership who can accrue very, very great debts, misallocate the sums that they borrow, and that they borrow voluntarily, right, for development. At least is what is the intention that's stated, and then these funds are misallocated or maybe even stolen, not because they're necessarily bad people, but just maybe the incentives exist. If we look at it from an incentives, right, economic, thinking about the political economy, right? So then what do you think about what can be done to align, we've talked about the rights, I think we've gone over the rights, the responsibilities that many believe nations, maybe even wealthier nations should have, but what about the holding also the nations on the other side, poorer nations? Yes, they're poor, but they should still be responsible, I think, and they should still be held accountable on how they conduct their affairs and how that conduct actually impedes or advances climate change objectives. Thank you.
Maria, can I throw that one to you in terms of accountability? Who should be held accountable? And is that accountability always equal?
Emmanuel, I think that's a fantastic question, and so I want to thank you for raising that. And I do think it's important that this conversation is not only about developed and developing nations, but it also is those that are least developed, and how we ensure and enable their participation and conversation. What I would say is my observations here is that the majority of the people that are leading the discourse around trade and trade policy for the sustainable future do not include the voices of those domestic organisations and communities. I haven't seen that. And part of the role modelling that we need to bring in this time is to be able to demonstrate different ways. And I'm going to think about our own practices at home where we are. We are asked by ourselves, we are challenging ourselves to be transparent. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? How are you doing it? And where are the benefits that are flowing back? We are challenging ourselves to be able to be better, be greater. And in that we are looking to scale trust, hope and transparency and honesty in what we do. That is a behaviour that doesn't require, at the moment, we aren't looking to the government to be able to entrench that behaviour. We are taking that behaviour and taking a real grassroots approach to that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that forums like this, they are unique, I understand, that they let the public and a diversity of thought enter. This should not be isolated to once a year or 3 or 4 days a year, because you can't get to the heart of the solutions, Emmanuel, that you are seeking. So those are the two things that I would offer. We have to role model different behaviours at home, locally, that do not need or require government intervention where you have that privilege. And secondly, these forums need to create more space where these discussions can be solved by us, with us, not at us.
I think that's a great point to end on. We have no more time. We're out of questions, although I would have loved to have talked to you for another hour or more. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you so much to our panelists, to the WTO. It was great to have you all join us. Thank you.